Here's another illustrated example problem for relative phase shift. Although they must necessarily have the same frequency for phase shift to have any meaning, waveforms needn't have the same magnitude nor even be the same quantity for there to be a relative phase shift to one another. Consider a voltage waveform, V of t, characterized by the following expression. V of t equals 169.7 volts times the sine of 360 times 60 times the time of interest. V of t has a peak value of 169.7 volts, a frequency of 60 Hz, a period of 1 over 60, or approximately 16.7 milliseconds, and a phase shift of 0 degrees, meaning it's not phase shifted, and its zero crossing going positive occurs at 0 degrees, or 0 milliseconds. Consider a current waveform I of t in blue, characterized by the following expression. I of t equals 200 milliamperes times the sine of 360 times 60 times the time of interest minus 20 degrees. I of t has a peak value of 200 milliamperes, a frequency of 60 Hz, a period of approximately 16.7 milliseconds, and a phase shift of negative 20 degrees, meaning it's shifted negative 20 degrees backwards. 20 degrees inside a 16.7 millisecond period corresponds to a rightward time shift of roughly 925.9 microseconds, as this operation chain illustrates. When both these waveforms are placed on the same graph, there is an obvious relationship between the two. It's immediately evident that V of t zero crossing going positive is 20 degrees in front of I of t zero crossing going positive, and voltage can be said to lead current by 20 degrees. Conversely, given I of t zero crossing going positive 20 degrees behind V of t zero crossing going positive, it can also be said that current lags voltage by 20 degrees. Both statements, voltage leads current by 20 degrees, and current lags voltage by 20 degrees, are simultaneously true. Which statement do I prefer? This one. Current lags voltage by 20 degrees. Why? Because voltage is the cause and current is the effect. It makes sense to measure the effect with reference to the cause. We'll examine AC Ohm's law and more in greater detail in later lectures. Here's yet another illustrated example of relativity, only this time both waveforms include phase shifts. Consider a voltage waveform in red, V of t, characterized by the following expression. V of t equals 21.7 volts times the sine of 360 times 35 times the time of interest plus 23.6 degrees. V of t has a peak value of 21.7 volts, a frequency of 35 Hz, a period of 1 over 35, or approximately 28.6 milliseconds, and a phase shift of plus 23.6 degrees, meaning it's shifted 23.6 degrees forward. 23.6 degrees inside a 28.6 millisecond period corresponds to a leftward time shift of roughly 1.9 milliseconds, as the operation chain illustrates. V of t zero crossing going positive occurs 23.6 degrees to the left, or 1.9 milliseconds in advance. The current waveform I of t is characterized by the following expression. I of t equals 71.4 milliamperes times the sine of 360 times 35 times the time of interest plus 55.7 degrees. I of t has a peak value of 71.4 milliamperes, a frequency of 35 Hz, a period of 28.6 milliseconds, and a phase shift of positive 55.7 degrees, meaning it's shifted positive 55.7 degrees forward. 55.7 degrees inside a 28.6 millisecond period corresponds to a leftward time shift of roughly 4.4 milliseconds, as this operation chain illustrates. When both these waveforms are placed in the same graph, there's an obvious relationship between the two. It's immediately evident that I of t zero crossing going positive is in front of V of t zero crossing going positive, and current can be said to lead voltage. By how much does current lead? It should be obvious that current leads voltage by the absolute difference of 32.1 degrees. Similarly, it could also be said that voltage lags current by 32.1 degrees. Both statements are simultaneously true. However, I prefer framing this using voltage as my reference from which current is measured, since voltage is the cause and current is the effect. In summary, current leads voltage by 32.1 degrees. Here's another illustrated example problem. This one again making use of two waveforms, both including phase shifts, but without all the gory details. Looks like the plot of V of t in red, shows its phase shift at positive 28 degrees, and the plot of I of t in blue shows its phase shift at negative 12 degrees. What's the relationship of current with respect to voltage? Does it lead or does it lag, and by how much? Don't make this hard. Too often, students make this unnecessarily complicated. Just look at the picture. Figure it out. Which one is in front of the other, and by how much? Hopefully you realize that current's zero crossing going positive is behind voltage's zero crossing going positive, and current can be said to lag voltage. By how much does current lag? It should be obvious that current lags by the absolute difference of 40 degrees. If you're interested in converting between angular phase shift and time, let's assume both these waveforms have a frequency of 60 Hz and a period of approximately 16.7 milliseconds. 28 degrees inside a 16.7 millisecond period corresponds to a leftward time shift of roughly 1.3 milliseconds, as this operation chain illustrates. 12 degrees inside a 16.7 millisecond period corresponds to a rightward time shift of roughly 555.6 microseconds, as this operation chain illustrates. This means that the current waveform zero crossing going positive would lag approximately 1.85 milliseconds behind the voltage waveform zero crossing going positive. If you wanted to check your work, 1.85 milliseconds inside a 16.7 millisecond period corresponds to an angular shift of roughly 40 degrees, as we'd expect. If you're still thirsty for some more relative phase shift example problems, feel free to tackle this additional set. Don't be hard-headed and unnecessarily complicate this ordinarily simple task. Just look at the pictures. Which waveform is in front of the other, and by how much? Let's assume voltage is in red and current is in blue. Let's assume everybody's got a frequency of 60 Hz and a period of 16.7 milliseconds. By all means, pause the lecture and try this on your own. If you're tracking, you should have arrived at the following results. For example problem 1, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of 0 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of negative 90 degrees, it can be said that current lags voltage by 90 degrees. As we'll learn in later lectures, this is the typical response for purely inductive elements. For example problem 2, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of 0 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of positive 90 degrees, it can be said that current leads voltage by 90 degrees. As we'll learn in later lectures, this is a typical response for purely capacitive elements. The remaining example problems make use of voltage and current waveforms that both include phase shifts. For example, problem 3, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of negative 32 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of positive 14 degrees, it can be said that current leads voltage by the absolute difference of 46 degrees. For example, problem 4, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of negative 15 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of negative 25 degrees, it can be said that current lags voltage by the absolute difference of 10 degrees. For example, problem 5, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of positive 60 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of positive 40 degrees, it can be said that current lags voltage by the absolute difference of 20 degrees. Finally, for example, problem 6, given the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of negative 45 degrees, and the current waveform in blue has a phase shift of negative 27 degrees, it can be said that current leads voltage by the absolute difference of 18 degrees. Alright, 3 more bonus round relative phase shift problems before I cut you loose. Be warned, these aren't as easy as they look and are meant to illustrate some peculiarities you might encounter, as well as establish some standard operating procedures when you do. For the first example problem on the top, the voltage waveform in red has a phase shift of positive 22 degrees, and the current waveform in blue also has a phase shift of positive 22 degrees. What's the relative phase shift between them? The answer is that there is no relative phase shift, since they've both got a phase shift of positive 22 degrees. Voltage and current simultaneously peak and valley because they are in phase with one another. This is characteristic of purely resistive elements. For the second example problem in the middle, voltage waveform V1 in red has a phase shift of positive 90 degrees, and the voltage waveform V2 in yellow has a phase shift of negative 90 degrees. What's the relative phase shift between them? The answer is that they are perfectly out of phase with one another since they're 180 degrees apart. Positive 180 or negative 180 doesn't make a difference since they're totally opposite of each other. V1 peaks when V2 valleys, and vice versa. As we'll learn in later lectures, this occasion of equal and opposite voltages can be encountered in resonant circuits. Finally, for the third example problem on the bottom, looks like we've got three voltage waveforms: L1 in black, L2 in red, and L3 in blue. We're assuming L1 in black is our reference waveform, and it has a phase shift of 0 degrees. L2 in red has a phase shift of negative 120 degrees, and can be said to lag L1 by 120 degrees. We're given an option for L3 in blue. Does L3 lag L1 by 240 degrees, or does it lead it by 120 degrees? As we've previously demonstrated, negative 240 degrees is equivalent to positive 120 degrees, but what is the preferred means of expressing this relative phase shift? The answer is L3 leads L1 by positive 120 degrees, since it's easier to conceptualize positive 120 degrees than negative 240 degrees. The point being that phase shift is typically expressed between 0 and 180. Above 180 in one direction is better represented as below 180 in the other. Given this relationship, it can be said that L2 lags L1 by 120, and L3 leads L1 by 120. Similarly, it can be said that L1 leads L2 by 120, and L3 lags L2 by 120. Coming at this from yet another angle, it can also be said that L1 lags L3 by 120, and L2 leads L3 by 120. The point being that these three waveforms all have a relative shift of 120 degrees between each other and represent a balanced system. As we'll learn in later lectures, this occasion of three otherwise identical voltage waveforms with 120 degree relative shifts between them is a characteristic of three-phase AC, a common means of industrial power distribution, and truly one of my favorite topics. Alright, that's about enough for today. Hopefully you did well in the last set of example problems. This might seem like an easy exercise for some of you. However, in my experience, I've found a not insignificant number of students that struggle with this because they try to develop some shortcut that always backfires on them. Here's a shortcut that always works. Draw a picture and look at it. Don't make this hard and don't mess it up, because as we'll learn in later lectures, relative phase shift between voltage and current is critical in determining the nature of an unknown element's impedance, as well as calculating apparent, real, and reactive power for elements in larger AC circuits. All this and more awaits. Until then, you'll be happy to know that this kind of completes our discussion of sine waves. Over the past handful of lectures, we've looked at circles, angles, radians, the sine function itself, the inverse sine function, peak values, peak-to-peak values, effective and RMS values, period, frequency, time-dependent sinusoidal analysis, and now phase shift and relative phase shift. You'd think that'd be all there is to know about sine waves, but it isn't. There's a lot more fascinating stuff out there, but the truth is, absolutely none of it has any bearing to an aspiring electromechanical technician. In summary, the material as I've presented in this short sequence is the absolute minimum skill set necessary for survival. If you are still shaky about any of this material, by all means rewind, revisit, and review it until you're ready to enter the jungle. Before we bring this lecture to a close, allow me a moment to wave a lit torch in the face of educators and students worldwide. Snap out of it and quit doing this because it's wrong. At times in my life, I have been labeled a heretic for the simple act of pointing out an obvious fallacy to the brainwashed sheep around me. Case in point, my grade school teacher labeled me so because I refused to accept the commonly held delusion that the world has 7 continents. My teacher pointed to a map and said North America, South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, Europe, Asia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I stood up and said no. There are 6 continents: North America, South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, Eurasia. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In addition to proving her wrong, I further went on to tell her she was simply parroting the politically expedient division of Europe and Asia into separate continents to reflect the political divisions of our world at the time, and not those properties that actually define a continent. This precociousness did not endear me to her, but I would not yield to falsehood. I know the world has 6 continents, and you can't tell me it doesn't. Which brings us to the incorrect time domain representation of sine waves as traditionally presented to first-year engineering technicians. I know this is wrong. I will not accept it's right, and neither should you. For some reason, textbooks traditionally represent time-variant sine functions in this fashion. V of t equals voltage peak times the sine of 2 pi times the frequency times the time of interest plus or minus the phase shift, where 2 pi is intended to convey the product of frequency and time into radians, yet phase shift is still expressed in units of degrees. This is wrong and will always be wrong. To put it another way, this is not right and will never be right. The point being, you cannot mix radians and degrees. Pick one and stick with it. For my purposes, I use degrees and degrees only, as should you. If you're one of those old-timey folks that still reads newspapers printed on paper and makes and receives calls using a landline, by all means, use radians like all the other old fossils out there, but all the cool kids nowadays are using degrees. In pursuit of a brighter future, I am asking you to do your small part by publicly burning any textbook or subjecting your teacher to an expedient military tribunal if they use this incorrect general format. You cannot mix radians and degrees, and suggesting you can is criminally unbecoming. Alright, that's about enough for today. In conclusion, this lecture presented time-variant sinusoidal waveforms including positive or negative angular phase shift. Additionally, we examined sinusoidal waveforms that lead or lag one another. Remember to review this material as often as you need to really drive it home. Imagine how well lab will go if you know what you're doing. Thank you very much for your attention and interest. We'll see you again during the next lecture of our series. Remember to tell your Lazy Lab partner about this resource, and be sure to check out the Big Bad Tech channel for additional resources and updates.